Yes, I'm sure Spanish people have lots to be happy about today. However, don't forget that 215 years ago you lost because you had the first declaration of independence from the Spanish crown in the Americas, coming straight from La Paz, capital of Bolivia, declaring its independence and starting the La Paz Revolution. I'm sure Spanish people will have their day ruined today. Now, we have gone through looking at the DPS results in the beta, mostly by looking at the raid testing, especially the Mythic raid testing. We then did the same for healers. However, there is a problem. We can't quite do the same for tanks because going out, scouring the raid results doesn't really tell us much about tanking. So instead, we have to go and look at Mythic Plus. That's where the juice is for tanking. So after going through several of the logs and the results of the tanks in Mythic Plus for now, we start with the worst of the bunch, which is the currently best of the bunch in Dragonflight, Vengeance Demon Hunter. Now the spec at the bottom, to be fair, is not at a very deep bottom, it's quite shallow, as evidenced by just being in the B tier as being at the bottom. The TLDR really is just that they lost their double sigils. And the slightly longer TLDR, they also lost their very powerful, amongst the strongest for tanks right now, tier set of these past couple of seasons. More damage, more healing, more stamina flat in the two-piece alone is very, very powerful. Nowhere near the level of power on what you will get in the War Within. Literally nothing else in your talent tree is changing besides getting nerfed. So now you can only hope from something good coming from the hero talents. Admittedly, you are getting something good from the hero talent. In fact, both of these are quite good. Now, there might be some annoyance in how they force you to play, specifically Aldrachi Reaver is even pushing you away from playing around Spirit Bomb altogether and instead focus on Soul Cleave. Reasoning for this is that the whole cycle around empowering your Throgglaive is that it buffs Fracture and Soul Cleave. It buffs Soul Cleave, it makes you do even more AoE with Soul Cleave, it gives you even more flat damage with Soul Cleave. Once you have extinguished the buffs of both abilities, you get 20% more damage and healing and attack speed. So everything around Soul Cleave makes you way more prone to start ditching Spirit Bomb and playing more around that ability. The Aldrachi Reaver is a more stable and consistent type of hero talent. It can give you some very nice on-demand DR with 10% after casting Fellblade, which is quite strong. And then you have almost the opposite with Fellscard. It's much more concentrated in your metamorphosis. You just blow up for more damage after casting Soul Cleave and Spirit Bomb and Fell Devastation, Immolation Aura and Sigil of Flame inside of meta, doing extra damage. You also have extra resets when getting into meta to Sigil of Flame and Fell Devastation. A lot of power here is concentrated in meta and in AoE. Aldrachi has also a much higher single target damage than Fellscard. It's likely the default option for the raid. In Mythic Plus you might have, if you have enough of a meta of big mega pools all at once, where meta gains much more value, then Fellscard might be the option over Aldrachi Reaver. For Vengeance, at the end of the day, though, you still have to suffer the loss of your second sigil and the loss of your tier set, which is very painful, getting into the first season of the War Within, as well as one of the better haste scaling specs for tanks, losing out a ton of haste, going down from end of expansion mega stats to the start of the expansion starvation of secondary stats is also going to hurt Vengeance Demon Hunter quite a bit. That's why they end up at the bottom of this tier list based on the initial results. Joined, however, they're not alone because they're joined by Prot Paladin. So talking about not changing much, that's just about what happens to Prot Paladin. You have like one more talent being added recently. You also got your Moment of Glory, which you're still not playing anyways. You can play around with both hero talents, similar to Vengeance, although the ones for Vengeance are a bit more, can change a bit more your rotation and what you need to do with your spells. These ones, not really as much. Now, Protection Paladin at the moment is in a bit of a pickle. They are one of these specs being indirectly nerfed by the changes to HP to players in the War Within. We are getting far more HP than we are now. As mentioned by Blizzard, they are once again stretching our HP to max. There's a problem though. While this is not that relevant for DPS players, it's relevant for tanks because nowadays tanks tend to heal themselves, protect themselves, they are self-sufficient. However, some tanks are self-sufficient by creating absorb shields or by healing based on a percentage of their HP, or based on a percentage of their missing HP, or perhaps based on the damage they are taking. Paladin, however, does not. The healing that Paladin can do to himself is based on their attack power. So suddenly, things like, for example, your Word of Glory or even your Absorb Shield from Avenger's Shield become drastically weaker because they are based on the damage you're doing. But your damage is not increasing nearly as much as your health. So now it can get harder for you to become more self-sufficient after this stretch of HP compared to the AP, the attack power or spell power scaling of the damage you're receiving. As I said, besides this, not much is changing for Prot Paladin, still tons of utility, a whole lot of different cooldowns at their disposal. Now they have even more cooldowns technically because you have your Holy Armaments if you're playing Lightsmith, and now your Templar makes your Eye of Tyr even stronger because it's tied to the ability. So you're still an overall solid spec. There is just nothing, particularly standing out. It's not even one of those cases where, well, at least you have super top damage, right? Or something along these lines, or at least you are immortal, something along these lines. Prot Paladin doesn't actually have that. Now there is something extra though, because after Paladin, in the very same tier, there is a spec that actually has something special. Because Brewmaster does have the most insane tank damage we have seen in the beta. Now this is either a broken record or a major placebo effect, because I remember mentioning the insane damage of a Brewmaster Monk in Mythic Plus at the beginning of Dragonflight and at the beginning of Shadowlands, and now it's happening again. Which is interesting, right? Because Brewmaster lost Resonant Fists, they lost Bone Dust Brew, they lost White Tiger Statue, a whole bunch of extra free damage, but they gained all of it back and more thanks to Master of Harmony. This was a meme initial hero talent because it was based on your max HP, so players were immediately wondering, a Brewmaster Monk is obviously going to store this damage much more slowly than a Windwalker Monk because a Windwalker Monk can do more damage. This was now changed. Now this one very simply procs every time you use one of your major buttons. In the case of Brewmaster, it's Celestial Brew. Now you're already wondering, but that's bad because this is a defensive. You don't want to tie a defensive in order to do more damage. This is also fixed because now you get 2 charges of Celestial Brew while playing Master of Harmony. And this is, in short, an ungodly amount of damage. Picking a Brewmaster expert like Equinox, also not playing exactly with bad players, and you can see the damage of Brewmaster Monk is kind of getting out of control, thanks to, as we mentioned, the new hero talent Aspect of Harmony. And also to one of the buffs of Aspect of Harmony, if you're wondering what the hell is Chi Burst even doing here. Another buff from this hero talent is the double damage of your Chi Burst. Now, Brewmaster plays around the same. Besides this is just a passive effect you get, so it doesn't actually change your priority of abilities. Brewmaster does still suffer though from the same problem, because at this point it's the 3rd time we are saying Brewmaster is now doing top damage, but they are still a liability when they get to very high keys and they start taking a lot of damage. Their self-sustain starts lagging behind a bit. The stagger in very high keys kind of does become a problem and kind of starts pulling the attention of the healer more and more. That's mostly why we're not putting Brewmaster much higher up, purely based on their damage, because now it's happening for the 3rd time in a row, the 3rd beta version of an expansion in a row where Brewmaster has top damage and almost every time fails to show up in Mythic Plus, so we're not falling for it yet. Next in line, and this is where we go up 1 tier after we have gone through the first half of the tanks, it's Protection Warrior. So Protection Warrior might not have gotten actually any changes in their spec tree, but they have received a lot of QOL in their general tree. Their general tree was made way more pathable compared to in Dragonflight, especially through the middle. The middle was a congested nightmare of quite few options of pathing. Now it's much more open. You can kind of go wherever you want with those talents. And now also the bottom, the bottom more important parts of your talents have been skimmed down. You have a fewer point bloat in the bottom 1/3 of your tree, which is always good. And lastly, you have also skimmed down 4 talent points. Now you have 4 fewer points to spend in the general tree, giving you more freedom to roam around with your points, which is quite good. Now this is funny because now Protection Warrior is looking much better, and the last time they looked this good was exactly the last time Blizzard empowered to Oblivion their Thunderclap. in BFA with Azerite traits centered around the power of Thunderclap, which is exactly what this Mountain Thane hero talent is doing with Crushing Thunder, giving you 40% more Thunderclap damage, seismic reverberations affecting Thunderclap. You now have, more importantly, Thunder Blast, a chance to supercharge your Thunderclap and then getting them guaranteed whenever you enter Avatar. And more importantly, what this causes is tankiness. At the moment, Protection Warrior is the tankier tank in Mythic Plus, in terms of the amount of damage they can just straight up block. And ironically, in the actual sense of the word, shield block. One of the most dangerous parts in Mythic Plus, or practically the most dangerous parts on Mythic Plus when you're looking at a tank, not at a DPS, getting one-shot by a random, uninterrupted bolt of some caster. When it comes to tanks, the main problem is always the melees. It's always the auto attacks. It's always the just 6, 7, 8 mobs landing 6, 7, 8 hits at the same time on you. And that's also where Protection Warrior is at its best. It's not just your actual healing, which is visible here, of course, with Ignore Pain, but also the sheer amount of damage you can just prevent with shield block, as well as, talking about defensiveness, the sheer amount of uptime of Avatar. You know, this is an entire 40-minute key, so not exactly a short one, and you have almost a 50% uptime on your Avatar, as well as almost an 85% uptime on your shield block. Don't forget that defensive stance no longer reduces the damage you do. That's only for Fury and Arms. Now, for Prot, it's just a flat-out 15% damage reduction. You don't lose anything by playing in defensive stance. And then, thanks to the Mountain Thane hero talent, you also get practically a permanent 8% damage reduction because of the amount of times you get to cast Thunder Blast at least every 5 seconds, which also helps smoothing out the damage reduction and making you even tankier. Now, what is the problem? The problem is your everything else. Your damage is mediocre. You don't do particularly very high damage compared to some of the specs we have mentioned, like Brewmaster. Your utility remains reasonably weak. You have some decent things. You have your AoE stun, you have your single target stun, you can still get access to your fear as well as Rallying Cry, but you know, in general it is reasonably weak. You don't bring a combat rest, you don't bring Bloodlust, your raid buff is not nearly as good as a Vengeance Demon Hunter raid buff, because attack power buffs would have us imagining a Mythic Plus melee comp of just melee damage practically, which is much less likely, especially with the existence of things like Augmentation or Mage as a whole, so your buff is also not nearly as important. Those are right now the weaker parts of Warrior. But the rest of the kit, how you play now, plus Mountain Thane synergy with Thunderclap and your tankiness, overall tankiness to multiple hits, melee hits, auto attacks in Mythic Plus is very, very high at the moment. Next to Prot Warrior, in the same tier, we have Guardian Druid, or rather nowadays the Arcano Bear, playing Elunes Chosen around doing a whole lot of arcane damage, which is kind of what you have to do if you're playing Elunes Chosen, with the amount of synergy that you get in terms of extra damage from arcane abilities. That's practically the only thing you can do. Now, one thing, if anything, compared to the other tanks, you do have a bit more flexibility. The only talents somewhat locked in stone are the ones going towards the right side of the tree to make you an Arcano Bear, as well as sort of your, Incarnation Exodia to pick around the tree. But besides that, you can go for Earth Warden with 3 talent points down here. You can play more around group utility, picking the After the Wildfire side down here. You can get rid of this to get even more damage reduction from Scintillating Moonlight, 10% damage reduction, and Rage of the Sleeper as well. So you do have, 3 to 4 floating talents in your tree that you can play around with. However, playing around with those talents is not exactly going to make you play much differently in terms of what you will end up doing with your abilities. After all, you are still a Guardian Druid, so your options of buttons are still roughly 4 or 5. That's kind of what you have to play around as a Guardian Druid. Your damage has gotten quite good with the implementation of this Arcane Bear addition, whether or not you're playing the Moonfire Lunar Beam only type of build, or if you're playing the addition, the extra Fury of Elune talent in Elunes Chosen. Now, your typical profile, of course, is not moving that much. If you're still playing around the typical trope, I wonder what is happening around here, 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 and here, right? I wonder. I'm gonna go here, click on Incarnation, and then I'm gonna look at the damage done, and that's where you do your huge pulls as a Guardian Druid. You can of course ditch that. You can simply not play with Incarnation. That is still your prototype as a build. So if there can be a meta where these kind of huge pulls, where you can benefit from the power of your Incarnation on a roughly 2-minute cooldown, at the moment you are quite powerful. And unlike Protection Warrior, you are a Guardian Druid, which means you have a Mark of the Wild, which is one of the strongest buffs to get in the raid, especially also for the damage reduction. You have a Combat Res, being a Guardian Druid, and you still have the typical utility you can find in a Guardian Druid, from Typhoon to Vortex, even to Heart of the Wild. So you also have more tools in a kit to be more useful. Perhaps what could be your doom in Mythic Plus is also at the moment the level of power of Resto Druid, because as you know, historically it's quite hard to imagine two specs of the same class to be meta in the same group. So there might be a point where players will have to choose, do we want a group with a Resto Druid or do we want a group with a Guardian Druid? That's kind of possibly your main negative as a Guardian Druid right now. However, we are now left, not with that many spoilers I guess, with the last one being Blood Death Knight. Now, Blood Death Knight was, by a reasonable landslide, the most played tank in Mythic Plus, especially in the higher level keys from 10 onwards. Blood was definitely the most played tank. There wasn't even close. It was just a total victory, at least in terms of popularity as far as Blood DK. They have shifted mostly towards the Reaper's Mark Exterminate duo combo of Deathbringer, which is also giving them a much better damage profile and more consistent. DK, unlike some of the specs we just mentioned, isn't suffering at all from the nerfs of the health of players. Because, as we mentioned, for example, Guardian Druid has certain talents that become almost unusable now, like for example Ursoc's Fury, because this one gives you an Absorb Shield based on the damage you do. But your health is tripled and the damage stays the same. So this talent becomes terrible. We already mentioned Prot Paladin. Things like the Avenger's Shield, Absorb Shield or Word of Glory are based on attack power. So if you stretch the HP up and you don't compensate by making those abilities stronger, you get weaker. However, Blood DK works on something else. They work on Deathstrike. And Deathstrike heals you based on the damage taken in the last whatever seconds. That is completely irrelevant how much you stretch the HP of a DK. You could have raised our HP to 700 million and DK would have still functioned mostly the same. Not fully, because they still have, even them, they still have some bits of healing in their toolkit that still functions around attack power, but the one that actually matters, Blood Shield, which is just the overheal of Deathstrike, and Deathstrike itself, they are practically untouched by the nerfs to the health bar of players. Because again, it's all percentage health based. Blood Shield is a percentage of your health, Deathstrike is a percentage of the health you're losing, so you practically suffer no changes from the HP nerfs. This profile is so good for DK in Mythic Plus because you can bring down Reaper's Mark from its 1-minute cooldown down to a 30-second cooldown, which practically means, right, it means once per pull. It means every time you go into a new pool, you will have Reaper's Mark available to start a pull with. So it just lines up perfectly with what you want to do in Mythic Plus. Of course, again, if Mythic Plus turned into, we don't really need one powerful cooldown every 30 seconds, what we would rather do is a mega pull, where we pull the worth of 3 minutes of dungeon at once, then this is obviously much weaker because it's not nearly as strong of a cooldown on that many targets for that big of a pull. In that case, then something like Guardian, for example, would become stronger, or even something like Vengeance with Felskard, for example, compared to this profile right now of DK with Deathbringer. But as it stands, it has been the most played spec in Mythic Plus, especially towards the high keys. In the beta of the War Within, high damage, not the highest, but high enough, very good defensiveness and self-sustain. Of course, much like Brewmaster has had quite a few issues in very high keys, Blood historically has had a few. Those problems are that unless they get some talents, some legendaries, some Azerite traits, or corruptions, which give them some kind of damage reduction, some kind of way to reduce the damage they are taking, it will come a point where they will start getting one shot from just white melee auto attacks coming in all at once from big pools. It is something that has kept DK back from being meta for a very long time. The last time was in fact in Shadowlands, and that was only because their Dancing Rune weapon was also practically giving them free damage reduction when it was active. Right now you're not really getting any free DR from your General or Spec 3. You are getting one very powerful thing now for this problem, which is Rune Carved Plates. This is practically an always active 10% DR for the basic white melee auto attacks, which we pointed out is one of the most dangerous parts of damage taken by a tank. The melee auto attacks, not nearly as much your random casts of spell damage. So this is what we have for now as a recap going through the situation of the tanks, which is much more important to look at through the lenses of Mythic Plus, because for the raid it's gonna be much more strict, very often based on do we need some raid buff to fill all of our raid buffs you need. For example, is Mistweaver weak? Is Windwalker weak? Well, I guess Brewmaster is meta now in the raid because we still need the physical damage debuff. Is Havoc going to be absolutely terrible? Well, I guess Vengeance now is the meta tank in the raid because we need the magical damage debuff, right? So it's more important to look at this through the Mythic Plus results right now when it comes to tanks. So with this recap out of the way, it's now time to leave each other on this, what is this, Monday? On this Monday. Thanks, of course, as usual, to everyone who has been watching this video, as well as everyone who can support for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I am so smart. Yesterday I went out over to a friend, came out today to shop for some groceries, and my bike wasn't there. I actually parked it over at my friend's and I came back at night walking. Smart one.